In the summer of 1987, there was a player in Cincinnati who looked like the future of baseball. His name was Eric Davis. If you watched him play even once, you understood immediately that something about him was different. He ran like a sprinter, glided across the outfield like Willie Mays, and swung the bat with the explosive power of a slugger twice his size. Baseball had seen fast players before. It had seen powerful players before, but rarely had it seen someone who could combine both so effortlessly. By the mid-1980s, the Cincinnati Reds believed they had found their next superstar. Eric Davis had come up through the minor leagues with enormous expectations. Scouts described him as a five-tool player, the rare type of athlete who could hit for average, hit for power, run, field, and throw at elite levels. Those kinds of players only come along every generation or so. But even among five-tool prospects, Davis stood out. He had extraordinary speed. In the minors, he regularly stole bases with ease, accelerating so quickly that pitchers and catchers barely had time to react. In the outfield, he covered huge stretches of grass that most players could never reach. And then there was the power. When Davis connected with a baseball, it exploded off his bat. It wasn't the slow, towering kind of power that produced majestic home runs. His swing was quick and violent, the kind that produced line drives that seemed to disappear into the stands. By the time he reached the major leagues full-time in 1986, it was clear that the Reds had something special. But what happened next made people start asking a much bigger question. Was Eric Davis about to become the best player in baseball? The 1987 season answered that question with astonishing clarity. Davis played just 129 games that year, but what he accomplished during that stretch was unlike anything baseball had seen in decades. He hit 37 home runs and stole 50 bases, becoming one of the very few players in history to combine that level of power with elite speed in a single season. To understand how remarkable that was, you have to remember what baseball looked like in the 1980s. Players who hit 35 or 40 home runs were typically large power hitters who barely ran the bases aggressively. Speedsters, on the other hand, were usually smaller players who specialized in stealing bases but rarely hit for serious power. Eric Davis was doing both, and he was doing it at a level that made him look unstoppable. During one stretch in 1987, Davis hit 27 home runs in just 70 games. At that pace, if he had played a full season, he would have challenged the home run records of the era. Meanwhile, he was stealing bases, playing brilliant defense in center field, and changing the outcome of games almost every night. For a moment, it seemed as if baseball had discovered its next generational superstar. Teammates began comparing him to Willie Mays. Fans imagined him as the centerpiece of a Reds dynasty. Even opposing players admitted that Davis possessed a level of athleticism that few people in the sport could match. But something strange began happening as the years went on. Despite his obvious talent, Eric Davis rarely seemed to stay on the field long enough to fully dominate the league. He would produce stretches of brilliance that made him look like the best player in baseball. Then suddenly he would disappear from the lineup. Hamstring injuries, pulled muscles, unexplained soreness. At first, people assumed it was simply bad luck. After all, players who rely heavily on speed often deal with leg injuries. Sprinting at full intensity dozens of times a week puts enormous strain on the body. It wasn't unusual for base stealers to miss occasional games. But with Davis, the pattern kept repeating. Each season began with incredible promise, and each season seemed to end with another injury. Fans started to ask questions. So did the media. Why couldn't Eric Davis stay healthy? At the time, the explanation seemed simple. He was an explosive athlete playing an aggressive style of baseball. Injuries were simply part of the game. But the truth, the one that would only become clearer years later, was far more complicated. Because hidden beneath those recurring injuries was a physical problem that few people fully understood. A problem that quietly followed Eric Davis for years, and slowly began to erode the dominance that once looked unstoppable. As Eric Davis moved into the early 1990s, the flashes of greatness never disappeared. Whenever he was healthy, he still looked like the same extraordinary athlete who had electrified baseball in 1987. He could still steal bases with ease. He could still hit towering home runs. and in the outfield, he remained one of the most graceful defenders in the game. But the injuries continued. Hamstrings, back problems, muscle strains that seemed to arrive without warning. Each one interrupted the rhythm of a career that once seemed destined for superstardom. By 1990, Davis had already spent several seasons fighting through nagging physical issues. The Reds were still a strong team, and that year they would eventually win the World Series. But Davis was rarely able to play a full, uninterrupted season. Still, there were moments that reminded everyone of his remarkable ability. In the 1990 World Series against the heavily favored Oakland Athletics, Davis did something unforgettable. In the very first inning of Game 1, he crushed a home run that set the tone for the entire series. The Reds would go on to sweep Oakland in one of the most surprising championship victories in baseball history. For a brief moment, it felt like Eric Davis had finally returned to center stage. But once again, injuries followed. And this time, the situation was about to become far more serious. In 1991, while playing for the Reds, Davis began experiencing persistent health problems that went beyond the usual muscle injuries. At first, the symptoms were vague: fatigue, weakness, and physical discomfort that didn't have an obvious explanation. Eventually, doctors delivered a diagnosis that shocked the baseball world. Eric Davis had kidney cancer. The disease required immediate surgery, and for a moment it appeared that his career might be over. In an era when cancer diagnoses were still widely feared in professional sports, many players never returned to competition after such a major health crisis. But Eric Davis did something remarkable. He fought back. After undergoing surgery to remove the tumor, Davis began the slow and difficult process of rebuilding his strength. Rehabilitation was physically exhausting, but he remained determined to return to the game he loved. And against the odds, he did. Just 1 year later, Davis was back on a major league field. In 1996, while playing for the Baltimore Orioles, he produced one of the most inspiring comebacks in baseball history. That season, he hit 26 home runs and played a key role in Baltimore's postseason run. Fans who remembered the electric center fielder from the 1980s suddenly saw flashes of that same brilliance again. But the years of injuries and the toll of illness had already changed the course of his career. The explosive player who once looked capable of dominating an entire decade had spent too much time fighting battles away from the field. When Eric Davis finally retired, his career totals still reflected the talent everyone had once seen. He finished with more than 280 home runs and over 300 stolen bases. Numbers that placed him among the most dynamic players of his era. Yet many baseball fans still wonder what might have happened if circumstances had been different. What if the injuries had never arrived? What if the hidden health issues that quietly followed him through the early years of his career had been discovered sooner? Eric Davis remains one of the most fascinating what-if stories in baseball history. At his peak, he looked like a player who could have redefined the sport, a rare combination of power, speed, and defensive brilliance that few athletes have ever matched. For a brief moment in the late 1980s, it seemed inevitable that he would become one of baseball's defining superstars. Instead, his career became something more complicated. A story of extraordinary talent, relentless adversity, and a hidden struggle that slowly reshaped what could have been one of the most dominant careers the game had ever seen.